Welcome to our channel, where we lull you to sleep with the gentle, unhurried stories of the past. Tonight, we'll explore how medieval peasants endured plagues, an era marked by hardship, yet surprisingly ordinary in how common folk faced illness and uncertainty. As we wander through the daily lives of these resilient people, let the calm narration ease your mind and guide you into a peaceful, restorative sleep. Before the arrival of the plagues, life for medieval peasants was a delicate balance of hard labour, simple pleasures, and constant vigilance against the uncertainties of nature. The majority of peasants lived in small villages composed of clusters of thatched cottages made from wattle and daub, woven wooden strips plastered with mud and clay. These humble homes were dark and smoky, with a central hearth serving as the only source of heat, light, and cooking. Peasants worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the fields that surrounded their villages. Agriculture was the backbone of their existence, and every able-bodied member of the family contributed to the daily toil. Men ploughed the fields using heavy wooden ploughs drawn by oxen or horses, while women and children helped with planting, weeding, and harvesting. The land itself was usually owned by a feudal lord or nobleman, and peasants were required to give a portion of their crops as rent or as payment for using the lord's land. Life revolved around the agricultural calendar, and the changing seasons dictated the work to be done. Spring was a time of planting, summer of weeding and tending to the crops, autumn of harvesting, and winter of preserving food and repairing tools. The rhythm of the year was both monotonous and comforting, a predictable cycle that kept people grounded despite the uncertainties of medieval life. Inside the cottages, life was equally austere. The walls were thin, the floors often made of packed dirt, and the only furniture was a few rough wooden stools, a small table, and sleeping pallets made of straw. The hearth served as the heart of the home, where meals were prepared in simple clay pots and eaten from wooden bowls. Meals typically consisted of coarse bread made from barley or rye, a pottage of vegetables, and, on rare occasions, a small portion of meat or fish. Peasants rarely ate meat, as most livestock was reserved for the lord's household or for special feasts. Despite the simplicity of their diet, peasants made do with what they had. They gathered wild herbs and berries, foraged for mushrooms, and occasionally hunted small game to supplement their meals. Dairy products like cheese and butter provided necessary fats, and ale was the standard drink, as water sources were often unsafe. The brewing of ale was a communal task, carried out by women, and the alehouse became a place where peasants gathered to share news, gossip, and companionship. Religion played a central role in peasant life. The village church was the social and spiritual hub, and attending weekly mass was both a religious duty and a break from the daily grind. The church calendar was filled with feast days, saints' days, and religious festivals that punctuated the otherwise monotonous routine. These celebrations provided brief moments of joy and distraction, with singing, dancing, and communal feasting. Priests, monks, and nuns acted as intermediaries between the peasants and the divine, interpreting the will of God and offering guidance on how to avoid sin and suffering. Education for peasants was practically non-existent. Most could not read or write, and their knowledge was passed down orally through stories, songs, and proverbs. Superstitions and folk beliefs were widespread, and people sought meaning in everyday occurrences. A crow cawing at dusk, a sudden illness, or a dream of a departed loved one. These signs were interpreted as omens or messages from the spirit world, reinforcing the idea that life was governed by unseen forces. Peasants also relied on barter and trade, exchanging surplus crops for goods they could not produce themselves. Travelling merchants visited the village, bringing news from other regions, exotic spices, simple tools, or colourful fabrics. For most, however, life remained confined to the village and its immediate surroundings. The wider world was a distant, mysterious place, accessible only through the tales of travellers and the sermons of the village priest. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of community among the villagers. Families helped each other repair roofs, plough fields, or nurse the sick. Children played simple games with wooden toys or gathered around the hearth to hear elders recount old folk tales. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, villagers sat around the fire, spinning wool, mending clothes, and sharing stories. Yet, beneath this ordinary life, there was a simmering undercurrent of fear. Famine was a constant threat, as a single bad harvest could mean starvation. Disease was ever present, as common ailments like fevers, coughs, and infections could easily become deadly without effective treatments. Bandits roamed the countryside, and wars between lords disrupted trade and brought additional dangers. Even nature itself seemed to conspire against them, with harsh winters, unpredictable storms, and infestations of rats and insects. Despite these challenges, peasants adapted to the harsh realities of life. They learned to endure pain, loss, and suffering with a stoic resolve, accepting that hardship was a part of God's plan and that heaven awaited the faithful. Thus, they continued with their daily routines, unaware that a dark shadow was approaching, a shadow that would soon change their world forever. The arrival of disease in medieval villages was often as sudden as it was inexplicable. News of a strange, creeping sickness would first arrive in whispers carried by travellers, peddlers, or wandering monks who moved between towns and monasteries. These early warnings were frequently dismissed as mere rumours or as divine punishment visited upon distant, sinful lands. Yet, as more people fell ill and more villages reported outbreaks, fear began to spread like a dark cloud over the countryside. For most peasants, the concept of disease was a mysterious and terrifying phenomenon. They had no understanding of germs or contagion. Instead, they believed that illnesses were the result of malevolent forces, angry spirits, demonic possession, or the wrath of God. Some thought that the plague was carried by foul winds, or that it was a curse cast by a witch or a foreigner. When the first cases appeared in their own village, the panic was palpable. Families gathered around their hearths, locking doors and windows, as if they could keep the sickness out with mere wooden planks and whispered prayers. The initial symptoms were subtle, almost deceptively ordinary. A slight fever, a persistent cough, chills, and body aches. To the peasants, it seemed no more alarming than the common ailments that came and went with the changing seasons. But as days passed, the illness would progress with a terrifying speed. Swollen lymph nodes, painful darkened lumps the size of eggs, would appear in the armpits, groin, or neck. The skin would turn black or purple as the infection spread, and a burning fever would consume the afflicted, causing them to writhe and moan in agony. With each passing day, more people fell ill. The village streets, once filled with the sounds of children playing and women gossiping, grew eerily silent. The marketplace, once bustling with traders and farmers hawking their goods, became a desolate stretch of empty stalls and scattered straw. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay and the smoke of burning herbs, as desperate villagers tried to ward off the invisible evil they could not understand. Religious processions became a common sight. Priests and monks marched through the streets, swinging censers of incense and chanting prayers to ward off the plague. Some villagers fell to their knees, begging for divine mercy, while others lashed themselves with whips, believing that self-inflicted pain would atone for their sins and spare them from the pestilence. These flagellants, as they were called, travelled from village to village, their backs bloodied and their voices hoarse from chanting hymns. For the most part, however, the peasants stayed inside their homes, too fearful to venture outside. The once close-knit community became a patchwork of isolated households, each family huddled around its own hearth, too frightened to interact with neighbors who might be harboring the sickness. Friends avoided each other's gazes. Children were forbidden to play with their friends. Doors were barred and windows were shuttered, as if the disease were a tangible entity that could be kept at bay. Despite these efforts, the plague crept closer. The village healer, usually a woman skilled in herbal remedies and poultices, was besieged with desperate pleas for cures. She concocted potions of garlic, rosemary and wormwood, burned sage to purify the air, and recited protective charms over the sick. But no matter how many herbs she gathered or how many prayers she muttered, the death toll continued to rise. The healer herself eventually succumbed to the illness, leaving the villagers without their only source of medical knowledge. Graveyards filled rapidly. With each passing day, more bodies were carted off to hastily dug pits, wrapped in simple shrouds and buried without ceremony. The priests, overwhelmed by the sheer number of the dead, stopped performing individual rites. Instead, they offered mass prayers for the souls of the departed, standing amidst rows of fresh graves, with heads bowed and voices trembling. Rumours of the plague's origin ran wild. Some claimed it was the work of foreign merchants, who had brought the disease from distant lands. Others pointed fingers at neighbouring villages, accusing them of poisoning wells or casting curses. The Jewish community, often scapegoated during times of crisis, became a target for baseless accusations. In some regions, mobs attacked Jewish families, burning homes and driving people away, all in the misguided belief that such acts would rid the village of the disease. Still, the plague showed no signs of abating. Desperation bred bizarre rituals. Some villagers hung amulets around their necks, filled with crushed herbs or fragments of scripture, believing these charms would shield them from infection. Others smeared themselves with vinegar or urine, thinking it would repel the evil miasma that carried the sickness. A few even resorted to drinking potions made from ground-up toads or other unsavory ingredients, convinced that consuming poison would render them immune to the plague's deadly grip. Throughout it all, the sense of dread deepened. Each morning, families would wake to find yet another neighbour dead or another child feverish and coughing. The air, thick with smoke from burning herbs and the stench of unburied corpses, became almost unbearable. The once familiar village now felt like a haunted place, where every shadow seemed to harbour death, and every breeze carried whispers of doom. And yet, life went on, as it always does. Those who remained healthy continued to work the fields, albeit with far fewer hands to help. The crops still needed tending, the animals still needed feeding, and the village still needed food. The simple routines of daily life offered a fragile semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. People clung to these routines, even as the world around them seemed to be unravelling. But beneath the surface, a profound change was taking root, a shift in how the villagers saw themselves, each other, and the world beyond the village borders. In the face of so much death and suffering, old certainties crumbled, and new questions arose. Why had God allowed such a terrible fate to befall them? Were they being punished, or was there some deeper meaning behind the plague's devastation? And perhaps most troubling of all, would life ever return to what it had been before the disease arrived? In medieval times, the concept of disease was shrouded in mystery and fear. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, peasants relied on a combination of religious doctrine, folklore, and superstition to explain why people became sick. Illness was not seen as a natural occurrence, but as a manifestation of divine will, demonic influence, or the workings of malevolent spirits. Every sickness carried a deeper meaning, a hidden message to be interpreted, feared, and at times exploited. One of the most common explanations for illness was that it was a punishment from God. The church played a central role in shaping this belief. Priests would stand before their congregations, proclaiming that plagues and fevers were divine retribution for sin. According to the clergy, God was angry with humanity for its wickedness, greed, and neglect of Christian virtues. This message struck a chord with the peasant class, who already lived under the heavy burden of sin and guilt imposed by religious teachings. When the plague swept through their village, they saw it not just as a physical affliction, but as a spiritual crisis. People flocked to the church, confessing their sins, fasting, and praying fervently, hoping to avert the wrath of an angry God. However, divine wrath was not the only explanation for disease. Many peasants believed that sickness was caused by demonic forces. Demons were thought to roam the earth, seeking out vulnerable souls to torment. A person who suddenly became feverish or began to hallucinate was often said to be possessed. The church reinforced this idea, and priests would perform exorcisms, chanting prayers over the afflicted while sprinkling holy water and holding up crucifixes to drive out the evil spirits. The possessed person might be tied to a bed or held down by family members as the priest recited the sacred words, the atmosphere thick with incense and the muffled cries of the suffering. Alongside religious interpretations, there were also deeply rooted folk beliefs that attempted to explain illness. Some peasants believed that sickness was caused by the evil eye, a curse cast by a jealous or malicious person. The evil eye could be invoked intentionally or accidentally. A mere envious glance could transmit the curse. To protect against it, villagers wore amulets or charms, often inscribed with symbols or prayers. Some hung dried herbs, such as rosemary or sage, around their necks, while others tied red threads around their wrists, believing the color red repelled evil forces. Certain illnesses were also attributed to the influence of witches. Witches, it was said, could cause sickness by brewing potions, muttering curses, or creating puppets, dolls that symbolized their intended victims. If a peasant fell ill suddenly and without apparent cause, suspicion might turn to a reclusive widow, a midwife, or a woman known to gather herbs in the forest. These women, often feared for their knowledge of healing and plants, became convenient scapegoats. They might be accused of witchcraft, dragged before the village elders, and forced to confess under torture. Even those who were not accused lived in fear, for the line between healer and witch was thin and easily crossed. Astrology also played a significant role in medieval explanations of illness. Many peasants believed that the stars and planets influenced earthly events, including sickness. Astrologers claimed that when certain celestial bodies aligned or moved into specific constellations, they could exert a malign influence on human health. A solar eclipse, for instance, was seen as an omen of impending disaster, a sign that pestilence or famine was about to strike. Some people even sought out astrologers to cast their horoscopes, hoping to determine whether they would succumb to the current plague or remain untouched. Beyond the celestial and the supernatural, there were also more mundane explanations rooted in nature. The concept of miasma, or bad air, was widely accepted. People believed that foul odours, such as those from rotting corpses, stagnant water, or unclean streets, could carry disease. This idea was not entirely unfounded, as poor sanitation and the lack of waste disposal contributed to the spread of illness. To combat miasma, villagers burned fragrant herbs like lavender and thyme, filled their homes with the scent of vinegar, and covered their faces with cloth soaked in aromatic oils. Some even carried small bouquets of flowers, known as posies, which they held to their noses when walking through crowded or filthy areas. Certain animals were also thought to be harbingers of disease. Rats, cats, and birds were all regarded with suspicion. Cats, in particular, were associated with witches and the devil, and during periods of plague, many were killed in an attempt to eradicate evil influences. Ironically, this only worsened the spread of disease, as the reduction in the cat population allowed rat populations to surge, and with them, the fleas that carried the plague bacteria. Dreams, too, were scrutinized for signs of illness. A dream of falling teeth was said to predict the death of a loved one, while dreams of dark water or shadowy figures were considered omens of sickness. People kept dream journals and consulted wise women or local healers to interpret their nocturnal visions. If a dream was deemed to be a warning of impending illness, the dreamer might perform a counter-ritual, such as burning a specific herb or reciting a protective prayer. Even seemingly ordinary occurrences were interpreted as signs of disease. A sudden swarm of insects, an unseasonable frost, or the appearance of a comet in the night sky were all considered harbingers of disaster. When a village experienced an outbreak of illness, the people combed through recent events, searching for anything unusual that might have been a warning. This need to find meaning in the chaos was a coping mechanism, a way to exert a semblance of control over forces they could neither see nor understand. Despite the numerous explanations for illness, there was little consensus on how to cure it. Some turned to the clergy, seeking the comfort of prayer and penance. Others consulted herbalists, who brewed teas and tinctures from plants, said to have protective or purgative properties. A few even resorted to bloodletting, believing that draining bad blood could restore balance to the body. But as the plague spread and the death toll mounted, faith in traditional explanations began to waver. People who had been devout their entire lives died as quickly and as horribly as those who had committed sins. Priests and nuns, supposedly protected by their piety, fell ill alongside common villagers. Children, innocent and pure, perished as easily as the elderly. The inexplicable nature of the plague shook the foundations of the medieval worldview, sowing seeds of doubt and despair. In the end, the very lack of a coherent explanation for the plague only heightened the fear and uncertainty. People clung to their beliefs, their rituals, and their amulets, hoping that one of them would provide protection against the invisible enemy that crept silently from house to house, village to village, leaving death and devastation in its wake. When the plague swept through a village, it did not just claim lives, it disrupted the very fabric of society. Families were torn apart, friendships dissolved into suspicion, and communities that once relied on mutual aid became fractured and fearful. The plague's impact extended far beyond physical suffering. It also decimated the social bonds that had held medieval villages together for generations. One of the first and most devastating social impacts of the plague was the collapse of traditional family structures. In medieval villages, family units were essential for survival. Parents, children, and extended kin all worked together to farm the land, gather food, and perform household tasks. But as the plague spread, entire families could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. A father who had ploughed the fields every morning was suddenly too weak to rise from his bed. A mother who had tended to her children with tireless devotion lay feverish and delirious, unable to care for them. Children, once full of life and energy, succumbed to the disease with alarming speed, leaving parents to grieve over tiny graves. In some cases, only one or two members of a family survived. These survivors faced a grim new reality: fields left untended, crops rotting in the ground, livestock wandering the village without anyone to feed or milk them. Young children found themselves orphaned, wandering the streets in search of food or shelter. Older siblings became the de facto heads of households, struggling to take on the responsibilities of adults despite their own grief and fear. The psychological toll was immense. People who had lost their entire families often descended into a state of profound despair. Some wandered aimlessly through the village, clutching mementos of their lost loved ones: a wooden doll, a tattered shawl, a locket containing a lock of hair. Others retreated into their homes, barricading themselves inside and refusing to speak to anyone. Those who remained healthy found themselves isolated, their neighbours too frightened to approach or offer comfort, lest they contract the plague themselves. The social hierarchy also began to crumble. Before the plague, villages operated under a strict feudal system, with peasants at the bottom, vassals and knights in the middle, and lords and nobles at the top. Each group relied on the others. Peasants provided labour, vassals provided protection, and lords provided land and governance. But as the plague ravaged the population, this system became increasingly unstable. With so many peasants dead, fields went untended and crops withered. The remaining labourers found themselves in a unique position. They were now in high demand. Some began to demand higher wages or better working conditions, a radical and dangerous proposition in a society where peasants had always been seen as expendable. Lords and landowners, desperate to keep their estates productive, often agreed to these demands, further eroding the established social order. Some peasants even abandoned their villages altogether, fleeing to nearby towns or cities in search of work or simply to escape the stench of death. These migrants, many of whom had lost everything, formed a new and restless underclass, roaming from place to place, begging for food or offering their labour to the highest bidder. This transient population became a source of fear and resentment among the settled villagers, who viewed them as potential carriers of the plague. Religious institutions, too, were deeply affected. Monasteries and convents, once bastions of order and stability, became epicenters of death. Monks and nuns, who had dedicated their lives to caring for the sick, now found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of afflicted. Those who tried to provide last rites or offer comfort to the dying often contracted the plague themselves, leaving entire monasteries decimated. Priests, once revered as the moral and spiritual leaders of the community, were now seen as powerless. They had no answers for why God had allowed such suffering, no prayers that could halt the spread of the disease. Some fled their parishes, abandoning their flocks to their fate. Others exploited the fear and desperation of the villagers, selling indulgences or claiming to possess relics that could ward off the plague. These opportunistic priests profited from the misery around them, further eroding the already fragile trust between the clergy and the laity. Superstition and paranoia also intensified. With so many people dying so quickly, villagers became desperate to assign blame. Foreigners, beggars, and outsiders were viewed with suspicion, accused of spreading the disease intentionally. Jewish communities, in particular, became scapegoats, falsely accused of poisoning wells or casting curses. In some regions, violent pogroms erupted, with mobs attacking Jewish families, burning their homes, and driving them out of the village. Women who practiced herbal medicine or midwifery also became targets. Those who had once been respected for their healing skills were now feared as witches, suspected of using dark magic to bring the plague upon the village. Accusations of witchcraft became alarmingly common, and some women were dragged before village councils or local lords, forced to confess under torture or face execution. Amidst all this chaos, social rituals and customs that had once brought people together fell by the wayside. Weddings were postponed indefinitely, as people were too afraid to gather in large groups. Funerals, once solemn and communal events, became hurried and impersonal affairs. Bodies were often buried en masse in hastily dug pits, with little to no ceremony. The village church, once the center of social life, became a place of dread, filled with the stench of incense and the haunting echoes of the dying. The breakdown of social norms also led to a surge in crime and violence. With so many people dead or incapacitated, law and order became difficult to enforce. Bandits roamed the countryside, looting abandoned homes and ambushing travelers. Some peasants, driven to desperation by hunger and fear, resorted to theft, stealing food or livestock from their neighbors. Conflicts erupted over property, as orphans and widows laid claim to land or possessions that had once belonged to their deceased relatives. Yet, even amidst the social disintegration, there were small acts of kindness and solidarity. Neighbors who had once been mere acquaintances now looked out for one another, sharing food, firewood, or a comforting word. Women gathered in small groups to weave shrouds for the dead, whispering prayers as they worked. Young boys took on the roles of men, helping to dig graves or tend to the livestock left behind by their fathers. In the evenings, those who were still healthy gathered around the hearth to share stories of the way things used to be. Before the plague, before the fear, before the world they had known began to unravel. These moments of connection, however fleeting, provided a brief reprieve from the overwhelming sense of loss and uncertainty. But beneath the surface, the bonds that had once held the village together continued to fray. The old ways were dying, along with the people who had upheld them. Traditions, customs, and social structures that had endured for centuries were now crumbling under the weight of so much death and suffering. The village was still standing, but it was a hollow shell of its former self, a place where trust had eroded, fear had taken root, and the plague's invisible hand continued to tighten its grip. In a world without modern medicine, medieval peasants had to rely on a variety of makeshift treatments and folk remedies to combat the symptoms of the plague. These remedies were a complex mix of herbal medicine, religious rituals, and deeply ingrained superstitions. While some of these practices had a basis in rudimentary herbalism, others were rooted in fear and desperation, driven by the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that pervaded everyday life during an outbreak. The first line of defense against the plague was often the herbalist or village healer. These individuals, usually older women, possessed extensive knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties. They gathered herbs like sage, rosemary, thyme, and lavender, plants believed to have purifying, protective, or restorative effects. Lavender was burned to cleanse the air and drive away evil spirits, while rosemary was steeped in water to create a fragrant infusion that could be used to wash the body and ward off infection. Garlic was another staple in the peasants' medicinal arsenal. It was believed to possess powerful antimicrobial properties, capable of warding off disease. Some villagers consumed raw cloves of garlic daily, enduring its pungent taste in the hope that it would protect them from the plague. Others fashioned necklaces from garlic bulbs, wearing them around their necks like amulets, believing the plant's potent scent would keep away the pestilence. Honey and vinegar were also widely used. Honey was considered a healing agent, applied to boils and sores to draw out the bad humours that were thought to cause illness. Vinegar, with its sharp, acrid scent, was used to clean wounds and was also soaked into cloths that people pressed to their faces to prevent inhaling the miasma, the poisonous, disease-carrying air that many believed was the root cause of the plague. Another common treatment involved bloodletting, a practice based on the theory of the four humours. According to medieval medical beliefs, the human body was composed of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these humours became unbalanced, illness would result. The plague, with its characteristic blackened, swollen buboes, was thought to be caused by an excess of bad blood. To restore balance, healers would make small incisions with a knife or use leeches to draw out blood. Patients would lie still, sweating and shivering as the blood dripped into a wooden bowl, their faces pale from the loss. However, bloodletting often did more harm than good. Many peasants were already weakened from malnutrition, and the additional blood loss only served to further sap their strength. Yet, in the absence of any other effective treatment, they submitted to the procedure, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers as the healer's blade sliced through their skin. Beyond herbal remedies and bloodletting, there were more extreme treatments that verged on the bizarre. Some healers advocated the use of animal products, such as ground-up toads or dried snake skins, which were believed to contain magical or curative properties. Toads, in particular, were considered effective against the plague. Healers would capture a toad, cut it open, and place it over the infected buboes, believing the creature would draw out the disease. If the toad swelled and died, it was taken as a sign that it had absorbed the poison, and the patient was considered cleansed. In other cases, the afflicted were urged to bathe in urine, either their own or that of a healthy person. Urine was considered a sterile substance and was thought to possess medicinal properties that could cleanse the body of infection. Peasants would collect their urine in clay pots, letting it sit and ferment for days before using it to wash their skin or soak bandages. The stench was overpowering, but in the face of the relentless plague, people were willing to try anything. Fumigation was another common practice. In an attempt to cleanse the air of miasma, villagers burned fragrant herbs, resins, and even sulfur. The pungent smoke filled their cottages, choking the air and stinging the eyes, but they endured it, convinced that the foul odor would counteract the even fouler air carrying the plague. Some peasants placed burning coals in iron braziers, heaping them with rosemary, juniper, or frankincense. Others threw dried herbs onto their hearth fires, hoping the rising smoke would purify their homes. Certain rituals blurred the line between medicine and magic. For instance, the use of amulets became widespread during outbreaks of plague. These amulets were often inscribed with sacred symbols, prayers, or the names of saints. Some contained small pieces of parchment bearing protective spells or biblical verses, folded tightly and wrapped in cloth. Others were simple pouches filled with herbs like sage, yarrow, or wormwood, which were believed to ward off evil spirits. Another common talisman was the abracadabra triangle, a sequence of letters arranged in a diminishing triangle shape. The word abracadabra was written at the top, with each subsequent line omitting a letter until only the letter A remained. Peasants wore these triangles around their necks, hoping the incantation would magically dissipate the plague just as the letters faded away. In addition to these individual remedies, communal rituals were also employed. During especially severe outbreaks, entire villages would gather for public penance. Peasants would strip down to their underclothes, kneel in the mud, and flog themselves with leather whips, crying out for God's mercy. This act of self-punishment was believed to atone for sins and appease God's wrath, thus halting the plague. These processions, known as flagellant marches, became increasingly common during the Black Death, with men and women lashing themselves bloody in the streets as onlookers wept and prayed. Some villages even resorted to more sinister methods, such as burning witches or scapegoats believed to be responsible for the outbreak. Women who practiced herbalism or midwifery were particularly vulnerable to these accusations. If a healer's patient died despite her treatments, rumors would spread that she had cursed the victim or consorted with demons. Mobs would gather, dragging the accused woman from her home, tying her to a stake, and setting her alight, all the while chanting prayers to cleanse the village of her evil influence. For those who could afford it, there were also more sophisticated treatments offered by physicians. These doctors, trained in the universities of the time, relied on elaborate concoctions called theriac. Theriac was a complex medicinal paste made from dozens of ingredients, including opium, snake flesh, and exotic spices. It was believed to be a universal antidote, capable of curing any poison or plague. But theriac was expensive, far beyond the reach of most peasants, who had to make do with crude substitutes like garlic paste or vinegar infusions. Despite the sheer variety of treatments and remedies, the effectiveness of these methods was questionable at best. Most remedies did little to stem the tide of infection, and some, like bloodletting or urine baths, likely exacerbated the suffering of the sick. Yet in a world without antibiotics, antiseptics, or an understanding of germ theory, these desperate measures provided at least the illusion of control, a fragile shield against the overwhelming terror of the plague. To the average peasant, the line between medicine and magic was blurred, and anything that offered a glimmer of hope, however improbable, was seized upon with fervour. Whether it was a clove of garlic, a toad placed over a boil, or a prayer whispered into the night, each remedy was a small, desperate act of defiance against a world that had seemingly descended into chaos. In the depths of the medieval era, religion was not just a part of life, it was life itself. The church towered over every aspect of existence, from the grand cathedrals in bustling cities to the humble village chapels where peasants gathered to hear sermons and seek solace. When the plague began its merciless sweep through villages, the spiritual response was immediate and intense. Peasants, who had always viewed disease as a manifestation of divine wrath or demonic influence, turned to the church with desperate pleas for salvation, guidance, and some semblance of understanding. The clergy became the frontline spiritual healers, though they were often as powerless against the plague as the common people. Priests, monks, and nuns were expected to minister to the sick and dying, offering last rites, blessings, and prayers. However, the sheer scale of death overwhelmed them. Parish priests found themselves conducting multiple funerals each day, their voices hoarse from reciting the same prayers over and over. Graveyards filled up rapidly, forcing villagers to dig mass graves, each one a silent testament to the lives that had been lost. In the face of such relentless death, many clergy members were also consumed by fear. Some fled their parishes, abandoning their flocks to seek refuge in remote monasteries or isolated hermitages. Others remained, but their faith began to crumble under the weight of so much suffering. How could a merciful God allow such devastation? How could they continue to preach hope and redemption when children lay dying in their mother's arms, their bodies ravaged by oozing buboes and searing fevers? For the peasants, the question of divine retribution became a daily torment. The plague was seen as a punishment from God, a terrifying scourge sent to cleanse the world of sin. Villagers searched for signs of God's wrath, examining their own lives and those of their neighbours for evidence of transgressions. Had they sinned too much? Had they failed to attend Mass regularly? Had they harboured impure thoughts, spoken ill of others, or neglected to tithe properly? In response, public acts of penance became commonplace. Flagellant processions emerged as a stark expression of collective guilt and repentance. Groups of men, often dressed in simple robes or even stripped to the waist, marched through the village streets, chanting hymns and reciting psalms. With each step, they lashed themselves with leather whips embedded with sharp bits of metal or glass. Blood ran down their backs as they pleaded for God's mercy, hoping their self-inflicted suffering would atone for the sins that had supposedly brought the plague upon them. The sight of these flagellants was both horrifying and mesmerizing. Some villagers joined the processions, seeking absolution through the sting of the whip. Others watched from the safety of their doorways, clutching their rosaries and murmuring prayers, too terrified to participate, but too fearful to look away. The rhythmic chanting echoed through the streets, a haunting reminder that no one was immune from God's wrath. While public penance was a dramatic display of collective desperation, private acts of devotion also increased. Peasants filled their cottages with crosses, icons, and relics, each one believed to possess protective or healing powers. They lit candles before statues of saints, particularly those associated with healing and protection against disease. Saint Sebastian, who had been martyred by being shot with arrows, became a prominent figure in plague prayers. His image, with arrows piercing his flesh, was thought to symbolize the suffering of the plague victims and the hope that, like Sebastian, they might survive against all odds. Another saint invoked during the plague was Saint Roch, who was said to have miraculously healed plague victims during an earlier outbreak. Villagers hung amulets bearing his likeness around their necks, or placed small wooden carvings of him beneath their beds. Mothers placed Saint Roch's image beside their ailing children, whispering fervent prayers for divine intervention. The Church, desperate to maintain control over a terrified populace, intensified its teachings on sin, penance, and salvation. Priests delivered fire and brimstone sermons, warning that the plague was not just a physical affliction, but a spiritual one, a punishment for humanity's wickedness. The end of days, they proclaimed, was near. Villagers sat in packed chapels, their faces drawn and gaunt, listening to the booming voice of the priest echoing through the rafters as he listed sins that might incur God's wrath. Greed, lust, sloth, envy. For some, the fear of divine retribution led to extreme acts of piety. People donated their last remaining coins to the church, hoping to buy God's favor. Some vowed to abstain from earthly pleasures, renouncing wine, meat, or even human contact in a bid to purify their souls. A few joined monastic orders, forsaking their former lives to live as ascetics, spending their days in prayer and fasting, convinced that by suffering now, they might avoid eternal damnation later. Yet, as the death toll continued to rise, disillusionment began to set in. Despite their prayers, penances, and donations, the plague did not abate. The air still reeked of decay. The streets still echoed with the wails of grieving mothers. Fields lay untended, livestock roamed the village freely, and the sky seemed perpetually grey, as though even the heavens had turned against them. For some, this disillusionment led to a crisis of faith. If God was omnipotent and merciful, why was he allowing such widespread suffering? If the plague was a punishment for sin, why were innocent children dying alongside known sinners? Some peasants began to question the church's authority, whispering among themselves that the priests might not have all the answers. They muttered that the clergy, who were supposed to be God's representatives on earth, seemed just as helpless and terrified as everyone else. Others sought solace in older, pagan traditions that had lingered beneath the surface of medieval Christianity. The ancient spirits of the woods, the river goddesses, the protective charms and incantations that their grandmothers had whispered during times of illness. All of these resurfaced as people grasped for anything that might offer protection. Herbalists and cunning women found themselves sought after, their cottages crowded with desperate villagers seeking healing herbs, protective amulets, or whispered spells to keep the plague at bay. The church, aware of this growing undercurrent of pagan practices, responded with increased vigilance. Sermons denounced witchcraft and heresy, warning that those who dabbled in such things were in league with the devil. Villagers were encouraged to report anyone suspected of using magic or consorting with demons. This led to a rise in accusations, with some peasants turning on their neighbours, eager to place the blame for the plague on someone, anyone, even those they had once considered friends. Despite the church's attempts to maintain control, the plague had shaken the foundations of medieval spirituality. The rigid structure of faith had begun to crack, allowing doubt, fear, and old superstitions to seep through. For some, the plague was a test of faith, a crucible through which the truly devout would emerge purified and redeemed. For others, it was proof that God had either abandoned them or was powerless to help. In the end, religion in the time of plague became a double-edged sword. For the faithful, it offered hope, structure, and a sense of purpose amidst the chaos. For the disillusioned, it became a source of frustration, a hollow echo of promises unfulfilled. And for those caught between faith and fear, the plague became a crucible, testing not just their bodies, but the very foundations of their belief in a just and loving God. The village marketplace was the heart of medieval peasant life, a bustling hub of activity where people not only bought and sold goods, but also exchanged news, gossip, and essential supplies. However, when the plague struck, this once lively centre of commerce transformed into a place of fear and danger. Markets, where people mingled closely and touched shared surfaces, became breeding grounds for disease. The once familiar faces of neighbours and friends now carried a silent, invisible threat, the possibility of infection. Before the plague, the market square was a sensory experience. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted from vendors' carts, mingling with the sharp, tangy scent of pickled fish, smoked meats, and freshly churned butter. Farmers displayed their vegetables in wicker baskets, while butchers hawked cuts of mutton and pork, flies buzzing lazily around the stalls. Craftsmen peddled their wares, hand-woven textiles, carved wooden bowls, simple clay pots, all the essentials of daily life. Women exchanged eggs for flour, milk for salt, while children ran underfoot, clutching scraps of bread or sweetened nuts. When the plague descended upon the village, however, these simple exchanges became fraught with peril. People began to eye each other suspiciously, avoiding handshakes and haggling from a distance. The vibrant atmosphere of the market grew tense and subdued. Conversations became whispers, and those who ventured out to trade did so with anxious glances over their shoulders. Many peasants resorted to makeshift precautions. Some traders began wearing crude cloth masks over their faces, hoping the fabric would block the deadly miasma, the poisoned air believed to carry the plague. These masks were often soaked in vinegar or infused with pungent herbs like rosemary, thyme, or lavender, whose strong scents were thought to ward off the disease. In place of the usual bartering, transactions were now conducted with as little contact as possible. Coins were dropped into basins of vinegar before being touched, the acidic liquid serving as a primitive disinfectant. Some traders even fashioned long wooden poles with hooks at the end, using them to pass goods and money back and forth without getting too close. Despite these efforts, the risk of infection remained high. Markets were still essential for survival, as most peasants did not grow all their own food or make all their own tools. The need for basic supplies forced people to take calculated risks. A widow with children to feed might brave the market to buy a sack of barley, wrapping her shawl tightly around her face and holding her breath as she moved through the crowded square. A farmer might desperately need a new scythe blade and risk approaching the blacksmith, exchanging his hard-earned coins with trembling hands. As the death toll mounted, the market square itself began to change. Where once there had been vibrant stalls and colourful banners, there were now vacant spaces and shuttered booths. Vendors who had succumbed to the plague left their stalls abandoned, their goods rotting under the harsh sun. Stray dogs and rats scavenged the remains, gnawing at mouldy bread and spoiled meat, further spreading disease. The smells of death and decay replaced the familiar aromas of baked goods and spiced ale, and the once bustling market began to resemble a ghost town. For those merchants who managed to survive, desperation forced them to alter their business practices. Some raised their prices dramatically, hoping to make a quick profit before they too fell ill. A loaf of bread that once cost a single coin now cost 3, while a slab of salted meat became a luxury few could afford. This price gouging fueled resentment among the peasants, who saw it as a betrayal of communal trust during a time of collective suffering. Arguments erupted in the market square, with heated accusations of greed and dishonesty. Others, however, adopted a more charitable approach. Village healers and herbalists, recognizing the desperate need for medicine, began to offer their remedies for free or in exchange for food rather than money. They handed out sachets of dried herbs, lavender, sage and wormwood, encouraging people to hang them in their homes or burn them over open flames to purify the air. Some even mixed up potions of garlic and vinegar, instructing peasants to drink the bitter concoctions in the hopes of staving off infection. But as the plague continued its relentless spread, even the most essential goods became scarce. Grain harvests went uncollected as farmhands fell sick or fled the fields. Flour mills ground to a halt, their wheels creaking uselessly in the wind. The village baker struggled to find enough flour to keep his ovens going, and when he did manage to bake a batch of bread, he rationed it carefully, cutting each loaf into smaller and smaller pieces to stretch his dwindling supply. Salt, once so plentiful, became a rare commodity. Without it, peasants struggled to preserve what little meat they could acquire, and the risk of spoiled food increased. Fishmongers, who had once brought fresh catches from the nearby river, now stayed away, terrified that contact with infected villagers would seal their fate. The few who dared to continue trading often charged exorbitant prices, knowing that the desperate would pay anything to feed their starving families. In some villages, the market square itself became a site of contagion. Sick and dying villagers, shunned by their neighbours and unable to return home, wandered into the square, collapsing beside abandoned stalls or slumping against the walls of shuttered shops. Their bodies remained there, uncollected, as few dared to touch them for fear of catching the plague. The stench of decay lingered in the air, and rats scuttled through the debris, their fur matted with filth, their eyes gleaming hungrily. Amidst the chaos, rumours began to circulate. People whispered that certain merchants were hoarding supplies, hiding sacks of grain in secret caches, or burying barrels of salted fish beneath their floors. Enraged by the thought of others profiting while they starved, some peasants began to raid the abandoned market stalls, breaking into shops under the cover of night. But these acts of desperation only fueled further distrust and fear, as people began accusing one another of theft, sabotage, and black market dealings. Despite the grim conditions, a few enterprising traders sought to capitalize on the chaos in more creative ways. Some began selling so-called plague amulets, small pouches of herbs or carved wooden charms that supposedly protected the wearer from infection. Others hawked miracle cures, claiming to possess secret remedies that could cleanse the blood or expel the evil spirits responsible for the plague. These dubious goods were sold at exorbitant prices, and those desperate enough to believe in their efficacy often spent their last coins on false hopes. Meanwhile, the church continued to exert its influence over market practices, insisting that merchants set fair prices and refrain from exploiting the suffering of their fellow villagers. In some cases, priests and monks patrolled the market square, publicly condemning those accused of price gouging or hoarding. But their efforts were often undermined by the sheer desperation of the people. In a world where death lurked around every corner, morality became a luxury few could afford. As the plague dragged on, the market square became a haunting symbol of what the village had once been, and what it had lost. Where there had once been laughter, music, and the lively chatter of vendors hawking their wares, there was now only silence. Where the smell of fresh bread and roasting meat had once filled the air, there was now only the sickly scent of decay and the acrid tang of burning herbs. For those who survived, each trip to the market was a reminder of the friends, neighbours, and family members who had once stood there, shouting prices, sharing gossip, or laughing at a shared joke. Now, their absence was palpable. a void that no amount of goods or money could ever fill. And as the sun set over the desolate square, casting long shadows over empty stalls and scattered debris, the peasants who remained could not help but wonder how much longer they, too, would last. The role of women in medieval society was already fraught with limitations, but when the plague swept through villages, their lives became even more complicated and precarious. With so many men falling victim to the disease, women were often thrust into roles and responsibilities they had never held before. While some found themselves taking on the heavy burdens of labour traditionally performed by men, others discovered new avenues of power and influence, albeit in unexpected and often dangerous ways. In many peasant households, the man was the primary provider, working in the fields, tending livestock, or engaging in trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, or milling. When the plague claimed the lives of these men, women suddenly found themselves as the de facto heads of households, responsible not only for maintaining the home, but also for ensuring the survival of their families. This meant they had to take up ploughing, planting, harvesting, and other grueling physical labour that they had previously been barred from performing. But the fields were unforgiving places, especially for women unaccustomed to such demanding work. The plough was heavy, the oxen stubborn, and the soil dense and unyielding. The physical toll was immense, and many women injured themselves attempting to handle tools designed for men with greater upper body strength. Yet they had little choice. Without crops to harvest, their families would starve. And with the workforce severely diminished, the labour of every able-bodied woman and child became a matter of life and death. In addition to physical labour, women also had to manage the economic affairs of their households. Those whose husbands had been skilled artisans or tradesmen suddenly found themselves thrust into business. A widow whose husband had been a shoemaker, for instance, now had to learn how to mend and sell shoes herself. The blacksmith's wife had to attempt basic repairs, even if she had never held a hammer before. While some women managed to adapt to these roles, others faced resistance from male guild members who resented the encroachment of women into their trades. For some women, the plague presented a dark opportunity to wield power in ways they never could have imagined. The fear and desperation surrounding the epidemic led to a resurgence of superstition, and those who possessed even a rudimentary knowledge of herbs and healing found themselves in high demand. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women, once respected members of the village, became both sought after and feared. They brewed teas of yarrow and feverfew, mixed poultices of garlic and vinegar, and whispered incantations over the sickbeds of the dying. But as the plague continued to ravage villages and the death toll mounted, fear and suspicion grew. The very women who had once been healers and caretakers were now seen as potential witches, scapegoats to be blamed for the devastation. The logic was simple, but brutal. If these women claimed to have knowledge of healing, could they not also possess the power to harm? Did they not brew strange potions and mutter strange words over the sick? Had they not survived while so many others had perished? Accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire, and women who had once been revered as healers now found themselves at the mercy of mobs. A single neighbour's accusation could lead to public shaming, beatings, or worse. Some were dragged before village elders, forced to confess to crimes they had not committed, while others were driven out of the village altogether. Those who stayed had to tread carefully, hiding their herbal knowledge, burning their medicinal texts, and pretending ignorance lest they become the next target of the witch-hunting fervour. Beyond the fear of being accused of witchcraft, women also had to contend with the threat of sexual violence. With so many men dead or dying, law and order began to break down. The social structures that had once protected women from predatory behaviour weakened as desperate, unmoored men roamed the countryside in search of food, shelter, or simply an outlet for their frustration and rage. Widows, particularly those without male relatives to protect them, became easy targets. Some women took drastic measures to defend themselves. They carried knives concealed beneath their skirts, slept with doors barred and windows shuttered, and travelled in groups whenever possible. Others disguised themselves as men, cutting their hair short and donning loose tunics to avoid attracting unwanted attention. But even these precautions were not always enough. In a world where the thin veneer of civilization was rapidly disintegrating, every encounter became a potential threat. Despite the dangers, some women managed to find ways to assert their agency and gain newfound independence. The collapse of the labour force created a scarcity of workers, and women who had never been allowed to work outside the home now found themselves in demand. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, began to hire women to plough fields, tend animals, and repair fences, work that had previously been considered too strenuous or inappropriate for them. With these new roles came the possibility of earning wages, albeit meagre ones. A widow who managed to secure work as a field hand could now provide for her children without relying on the charity of neighbours. A young woman who had learned to spin or weave from her mother could sell her textiles in the market square, using the coins to buy food or candles. While the work was grueling and the pay minimal, the mere act of earning an income gave some women a sense of power and purpose they had never experienced before. For young girls, the plague was a stark initiation into adulthood. With so many adults dead, children were forced to grow up quickly. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were expected to care for sick family members, cook meals, and perform back-breaking labour in the fields. Those who had once spent their days playing in the village square now found themselves digging graves, washing corpses, or scavenging for food. The plague robbed them of their childhoods, thrusting them into the harsh realities of a world where survival required constant vigilance and sacrifice. Marriage, too, took on a new and urgent significance. With so many men dead, the number of eligible bachelors plummeted, and families began arranging marriages for their daughters at even younger ages. A girl who might have once expected to marry at 16 or 17 now found herself betrothed at 12 or 13. The logic was grim but pragmatic. A girl who married quickly would have a protector, a provider, and a chance to produce heirs who could help work the land. But not all women accepted these roles passively. Some took matters into their own hands, refusing arranged marriages, fleeing their villages, or forming alliances with other women for mutual protection and support. Widows banded together, pooling their resources and sharing food, shelter, and labour. A woman who knew how to weave might trade her textiles for bread. A woman with a cow might share milk in exchange for firewood. These informal networks of mutual aid became a lifeline for women who had lost everything to the plague. Yet, even as some women found ways to survive and adapt, others were consumed by grief, despair, and exhaustion. The emotional toll of losing husbands, children, and entire families was incalculable. Many women found themselves utterly alone, with no one left to help them shoulder the burdens of survival. They wandered the empty streets, hollow-eyed and gaunt, muttering to themselves or clutching tattered blankets around their shoulders. The plague transformed the social fabric of medieval villages, leaving women to navigate a world where the old rules no longer applied. Some emerged stronger, more independent, and more resourceful than they had ever been. Others fell victim to despair, unable to bear the crushing weight of their losses. But whether they became survivors, victims, or somewhere in between, the women of the plague years played a vital and often overlooked role in the struggle to endure a catastrophe that reshaped the very foundations of medieval society. Religion was the cornerstone of medieval life, a powerful force that shaped every aspect of existence from birth to death. When the plague struck, its impact was not only physical but profoundly spiritual. As entire families perished, crops rotted in the fields, and villages fell silent under the weight of mass death, people turned to the church in search of solace answers, and redemption. Yet the church itself was not immune to the devastation, and its authority began to fracture as desperation mounted and faith wavered. Before the plague, the village church was the epicenter of communal life. It was the place where infants were baptized, couples were married, and the dead were laid to rest. The tolling of the church bell marked the hours, and the priest's voice echoed through the stone walls, delivering sermons on sin, salvation, and the promise of eternal life. On Sundays, peasants gathered in their finest, kneeling in prayer, chanting hymns, and confessing their sins to the priest, who served as both spiritual guide and moral authority. But as the plague tightened its grip on the village, the church faced a crisis like no other. Priests, monks, and nuns fell ill just like everyone else, and many died, leaving their congregations without spiritual leadership. Some priests abandoned their posts altogether, fleeing to remote areas in hopes of escaping the contagion. Others continued to perform their duties, administering last rites to the dying even as they risked infection themselves. These priests, revered for their bravery, became martyrs in the eyes of the faithful, symbols of God's mercy and the church's enduring strength. However, not all clergy were so steadfast. Reports began to circulate of priests who demanded exorbitant fees for last rites or burials, exploiting the desperation of grieving families. Some priests refused to enter plague-stricken homes, conducting funerals from a safe distance or refusing to administer sacraments to the dying. These acts of greed and cowardice sowed seeds of resentment among the villagers, who began to question whether the church was truly the embodiment of God's love and compassion, or simply another corrupt institution preying on the vulnerable. Despite these failings, the church remained the primary source of hope for many. With medical knowledge limited and doctors powerless against the plague, villagers sought spiritual explanations for the suffering that surrounded them. Was the plague a divine punishment for humanity's sins? Had God abandoned them? Or was the devil roaming the land, sowing death and destruction as a test of faith? Priests and monks delivered impassioned sermons, warning of God's wrath and urging the faithful to repent. They pointed to passages from the Bible, drawing parallels between the plague and the great floods, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the plagues of Egypt. In their eyes, the pestilence was a manifestation of divine retribution, a call for sinners to confess, atone, and beg for forgiveness. Some priests organized public processions, leading the villagers through the streets while chanting prayers, singing hymns, and carrying relics. The air was thick with the scent of incense as villagers clutched rosaries, weeping and wailing, imploring God to lift the curse that had fallen upon them. Flagellant movements emerged during this period, drawing throngs of believers who marched through the streets in grim, ritualistic displays of penance. Clad in simple robes, these men and women whipped themselves with knotted cords, their backs torn and bleeding as they chanted prayers of contrition. The flagellants believed that by inflicting physical suffering upon themselves, they could atone for the sins of humanity and appease God's wrath. As they passed through villages, peasants knelt in awe and terror, some joining in the self-flagellation, convinced that suffering was the only path to salvation. The church also promoted the veneration of saints, encouraging villagers to pray to specific holy figures who were believed to possess the power to ward off disease. Saint Sebastian, a martyr who had survived being shot with arrows, became a particularly popular figure, as the arrows in his body were seen as a metaphor for the pestilence striking the populace. Statues of Saint Sebastian adorned village churches, and peasants lit candles and offered prayers, begging him to intercede on their behalf. But as the death toll continued to rise and prayers went unanswered, doubts began to creep in. Why would a merciful God allow so much suffering? Why did the plague strike the pious as well as the wicked? Why did innocent children die while sinful men lived? The cognitive dissonance between the Church's teachings and the brutal reality of the plague led some to question the very foundations of their faith. Rumours spread of priests who had renounced God, declaring the plague a sign that he had abandoned humanity. Others whispered that the devil himself was behind the pestilence, possessing the bodies of the sick and using them to spread death and corruption. Some peasants, desperate to find a scapegoat, began accusing their neighbours of heresy or witchcraft, claiming that the plague was the result of secret pacts with Satan. In the midst of this spiritual chaos, alternative religious movements gained traction. Charismatic preachers claiming to have received divine visions roamed the countryside, attracting followers with promises of miraculous cures and prophecies of the apocalypse. Some preached that the end of days was near, and that only those who repented would be spared. Others denounced the established church as corrupt and wicked, urging villagers to reject its teachings and seek direct communion with God. The rise of these sects alarmed church authorities, who feared that their influence would undermine ecclesiastical control. Some preachers were arrested and branded as heretics, while others were forced into hiding. Yet, even as the church tried to maintain its grip on the spiritual life of the village, it could not stem the tide of disillusionment and despair. Meanwhile, within monasteries and convents, the plague wrought havoc on the religious orders. Monks and nuns who had taken vows of celibacy and poverty found themselves surrounded by death, their cloisters echoing with the coughs and groans of the dying. Some monasteries became makeshift hospitals, their halls lined with straw mats where the sick lay in agony. The monks and nuns, lacking medical knowledge, did their best to comfort the afflicted, offering prayers, food, and basic care. For some, the plague was a test of faith, a trial sent by God to strengthen their resolve. They prayed incessantly, fasting and engaging in acts of penance, hoping to atone for their sins. Others, however, fell into despair, questioning the efficacy of their vows and the purpose of their suffering. Some monks abandoned their cloisters, leaving behind empty cells and decaying manuscripts. The plague also disrupted the church's financial power. With so many dead, tithes and donations dwindled, and the construction of cathedrals, churches and monasteries ground to a halt. Some religious institutions resorted to selling indulgences, promising the remission of sins in exchange for money. This practice, while profitable, further eroded the church's moral authority, as peasants began to see salvation as a commodity to be bought and sold. For those who remained devout, the plague offered a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly life. Sermons became more apocalyptic, emphasizing the inevitability of death and the urgency of repentance. Priests urged their congregations to focus on the afterlife, reminding them that while their bodies might perish, their souls could still be saved. The concept of memento mori, remember that you must die, became a dominant theme as villagers decorated their homes with skulls, hourglasses, and images of the grim reaper. As the years wore on and the plague finally began to subside, the church emerged battered but not broken. Its authority had been shaken, its moral integrity questioned, and its congregations diminished. Yet, for those who had endured the suffering, faith remained a source of solace, a fragile but enduring thread that connected the living to the dead and the mortal world to the eternal. The burial process during the medieval plague years became a grim, almost mechanical task, stripped of its usual rituals and ceremonies. Death was everywhere, omnipresent and inescapable, and the sheer volume of bodies overwhelmed the traditional practices of burial and mourning. Graveyards that had once been solemn, hallowed grounds where villagers gathered to bid farewell to their loved ones, now became chaotic, overrun spaces filled with hastily dug pits and mass graves. Before the plague, burial customs were deeply significant to medieval peasants. The act of burying the dead was not just a physical necessity, but a sacred ritual meant to ensure that the deceased's soul would find peace in the afterlife. Families would wash and dress the body, often in simple linen or woolen shrouds, while priests would recite prayers and administer the final rites. Candles would be lit to ward off evil spirits, and coins might be placed over the eyes of the dead to pay the ferryman who would guide the soul to the afterlife. But as the plague swept through village after village, these rituals became increasingly impossible to uphold. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days, leaving no one to properly prepare the bodies for burial. The sheer number of corpses piled up at an alarming rate, and there were not enough hands to dig individual graves. Gravediggers, once a lowly but necessary occupation, suddenly became vital and dangerous. They worked day and night, often for double or triple their usual wages, but the risk of infection was high. Many succumbed to the plague themselves, their bodies eventually joining those they had buried. Mass graves became the only viable option as the death toll skyrocketed. Shallow trenches were dug in fields and on the outskirts of villages, and bodies were stacked one atop another, layer upon layer, with thin layers of dirt in between. There was no time for coffins or headstones, and the bodies were not laid to rest with the customary care and respect. Instead, they were hastily thrown into the pits, limbs tangled, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Some were buried still wrapped in their bedding or the clothes they had died in, as there was no one left to shroud them properly. In some areas, the dead were buried so quickly that the ground could not fully cover them, and villagers reported seeing the decaying limbs of the deceased protruding from the earth. The stench of decomposition hung heavy in the air, a foul reminder of the unrelenting presence of death. Dogs and other scavenging animals, driven to desperation by hunger, dug through the shallow graves, dragging corpses out to feast upon them. Some villages attempted to erect makeshift barriers or post guards to prevent such desecration, but the sheer number of corpses made such efforts futile. The lack of priests and religious officials further compounded the horror. In normal times, the priest would lead the funeral procession, sprinkling holy water over the deceased and chanting prayers to protect the soul on its journey to the afterlife. But now, many priests had died, and those who remained were either too overwhelmed or too terrified to perform their duties. Desperate villagers tried to conduct their own impromptu burial rites, reciting half-remembered prayers and making the sign of the cross over the bodies. Some even attempted to bless the graves with holy water they had saved or diluted with river water, hoping it would still carry some divine power. As the plague dragged on, the constant presence of death began to desensitize the living. Bodies became a common sight, slumped in doorways, rotting in alleys, or floating in village wells. The living learned to avert their eyes and keep moving, no longer pausing to offer a prayer or express grief. Burial ceased to be a solemn ritual and became a mechanical, necessary act, a means of clearing the streets and preventing the spread of disease. The psychological toll of this relentless exposure to death was immense. Gravediggers, who spent their days hauling decomposing bodies, became ghost-like figures themselves, their eyes hollow and sunken, their skin pale and clammy. They were shunned by the rest of the village, who feared that prolonged contact with the dead had tainted them spiritually, marking them as harbingers of death. Children no longer played in the village square, but sat silently by the hearth, listening to the ceaseless tolling of the church bell, each chime marking another soul lost. In some places, entire graveyards became so overcrowded that the ground itself heaved and swelled as the decomposing bodies shifted beneath the surface. During heavy rains, the graves would give way, exposing the remains and releasing the sickly sweet odor of rot. Some villagers reported nightmares of the dead rising from their graves, wandering the fields in search of vengeance for not receiving proper burials. Rumors spread of restless spirits haunting the outskirts of the village, wailing and moaning, unable to find peace. Desperate to contain the spread of disease, some local authorities resorted to drastic measures. Bodies were burned in large pyres, their ashes scattered to the wind. The sight of these burning pits, with smoke blackening the sky and the stench of burning flesh permeating the air, became a haunting fixture of daily life. Priests attempted to sanctify the pyres, murmuring prayers as the flames consumed the dead. But the sheer scale of the destruction left many wondering if God was truly watching over them. The constant exposure to death and decay also gave rise to a pervasive fear of being buried alive. With so many people falling ill and slipping into comas or delirium, tales began to circulate of people being mistakenly pronounced dead and buried while still breathing. Some villagers began insisting that bodies be kept above ground for several days before burial, just to ensure that the deceased were truly dead. Others tied strings around the wrists of the dead, attaching the other end to a small bell above ground. If the person regained consciousness and moved, the bell would ring, alerting the living that someone had been buried alive. Even as the plague finally began to subside, the impact of these burial practices lingered. Entire villages had been reduced to silent fields of unmarked graves, with no one left to remember the dead. Survivors walked among the mounds, unable to distinguish which patch of earth held their mother, father, or child. The customary markers of life and death, weddings, baptisms, funerals, had been obliterated, leaving behind a profound sense of disconnection and dislocation. In the years that followed, as communities attempted to rebuild, some tried to honor the dead by erecting communal memorials or planting trees in the fields where mass graves lay. Monks compiled lists of the dead, inscribing names in leather-bound tomes as a way of preserving the memory of those who had perished. But for many, the trauma of those burial years remained an open wound, a grim reminder of how easily life could be extinguished and how swiftly the dead could be forgotten. The devastation also gave rise to an obsession with mortality, as artists, poets, and writers sought to make sense of the overwhelming loss. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading the living in a grim procession toward the grave. These haunting images served as a stark reminder that death was the great equalizer, claiming kings and peasants alike, and that even in times of peace and prosperity, the spectre of the plague could never truly be forgotten. Burial practices, once steeped in ritual and reverence, had become a matter of grim necessity, and the psychological scars left by those years of mass death would linger for generations, shaping how people viewed life, death, and the fragile thread that connected them. The psychological toll of the plague on medieval peasants was profound, far-reaching, and often invisible, a shadow that lingered long after the immediate threat of death had passed. The relentless onslaught of suffering, death, and decay left deep scars on the minds of those who survived, reshaping their worldview and altering their perception of life, death, and even God. In a world already fraught with hardship, the plague became a crucible of fear and grief, distorting the collective psyche in ways that would resonate for generations. Imagine waking each morning to the haunting silence of empty cottages and abandoned fields, where the laughter of children and the chatter of neighbors had been replaced by the mournful tolling of the church bell. The village, once a bustling hub of life, had become a landscape of ghosts. Friends, relatives, and neighbors who had vanished overnight, their presence now reduced to fading memories and hastily dug graves. Those who survived were left to grapple with an overwhelming sense of loss, haunted by the faces of the dead and the guilt of having survived when so many had perished. Survivor's guilt became a pervasive psychological affliction, especially for those who had watched loved ones die without being able to save them. The sight of children wasting away, their small bodies consumed by fever and pustules, was an image that etched itself into the minds of grieving parents. Mothers who had nursed their sick children through sleepless nights, only to watch them succumb to the plague, found themselves questioning their faith, their worth, and the very meaning of life. Fathers who had buried their entire families beneath the cold earth wandered the fields aimlessly, their eyes hollow, their minds replaying scenes of death and dying in an endless loop. The psychological trauma was not limited to those who had lost loved ones. The constant proximity to death bred a pervasive fear that any moment could be one's last. People became hypervigilant, scrutinizing every ache and cough, dreading that it might be the first sign of infection. The mere sight of a blackened boil or the sound of someone coughing in the marketplace could send waves of panic rippling through a crowd as villagers instinctively recoiled from one another, fearful of invisible contagion. This fear of death was compounded by the deeply ingrained belief that the plague was a form of divine punishment, a manifestation of God's wrath. Priests, desperate to explain the incomprehensible suffering, preached that the pestilence was a consequence of humanity's sins, a punishment for greed, lust, and pride. These sermons, intended to compel repentance, instead fueled a sense of existential dread and spiritual despair. The faithful were left to grapple with agonizing questions. Why had God forsaken them? Why did the innocent die while the wicked lived? Was there any way to escape God's wrath, or had the entire village been condemned to eternal damnation? For some, the psychological toll of the plague led to profound disillusionment with the church and its teachings. Witnessing priests and monks abandon their congregations, fleeing in terror, or exploiting the suffering for profit, shattered the illusion of spiritual sanctity. If those who claimed to be God's representatives on earth could not protect themselves or their flock, then what hope did the common peasant have? This spiritual crisis eroded the foundations of faith, leaving many to question whether God was truly a loving protector or a vengeful, indifferent force that delighted in human suffering. In the absence of clear answers, some peasants turned to superstitions and folk beliefs to make sense of the chaos. Witches, demons, and malevolent spirits became convenient scapegoats, blamed for spreading the pestilence. Women who lived alone or practiced herbal medicine were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Their mere presence in a village could incite hysteria, as fearful neighbors whispered of curses, dark rituals, and pacts with the devil. Those accused of witchcraft were often tortured, beaten, or driven from their homes, the collective fear of the unseen enemy manifesting in brutal acts of scapegoating and violence. Yet, while some externalized their fear through witch hunts, others internalized it, sinking into profound melancholy and despair. The medieval understanding of mental health was rudimentary at best, and those who exhibited signs of depression or trauma were often dismissed as mad or possessed. Villagers who withdrew from society, refused to eat, or spoke incoherently were seen as tainted, perhaps by the devil or by the spirits of the dead. Some were locked away in dark rooms or abandoned by their families, their suffering compounded by isolation and neglect. The psychological impact of the plague was not confined to the mind alone. It also seeped into the culture and customs of everyday life. Art and literature became steeped in macabre imagery, reflecting the omnipresence of death. Skeletons danced across frescoes, leading the living in a grim procession toward the grave. Poems and songs spoke of rotting corpses, empty homes, and the futility of human existence. Even the lullabies sung to children carried dark undertones, warning of disease, death, and the inevitability of loss. One of the most profound cultural manifestations of the psychological toll was the emergence of the danse macabre, or dance of death. This haunting motif depicted death as a skeletal figure leading a procession of people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, priests, and children alike, in a morbid dance toward the afterlife. The message was clear. Death was the great equalizer, sparing no one, regardless of wealth, status, or piety. This pervasive focus on death also influenced the way peasants perceived time and the passage of life. The concept of memento mori, remember you must die, became a central theme in daily life, reminding the living that death could strike at any moment. Some peasants took to wearing simple wooden or bone amulets inscribed with symbols of mortality, such as skulls or hourglasses, as a way to keep death constantly in mind. The practice of visiting graveyards became a somber ritual, not only to honor the dead, but also to confront the stark reality of mortality. Despite the overwhelming darkness, some peasants sought ways to reclaim a sense of control over their lives. Rituals of purification and protection became common, as villagers burned herbs, hung talismans over doorways, and scrawled protective symbols on walls to ward off the plague. Stories spread of miraculous cures and holy relics that could prevent infection, and some peasants clung to these tales as a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope in a world engulfed by fear. But the psychological scars remained, and even as the plague eventually subsided, its echoes lingered in the minds of survivors. Nightmares of mass graves and rotting corpses haunted sleep. The smell of rotting flesh, once so pervasive, now triggered flashbacks to days spent digging burial pits and carrying the dead. Children, who had witnessed the death of entire families, grew up with a heightened sense of fatalism, convinced that life was little more than a fleeting shadow, a brief respite between birth and death. Some survivors emerged from the plague years with a newfound resolve, determined to seize life with both hands and savor every fleeting moment. Others, however, remained trapped in a state of apathy and despair, unable to move beyond the trauma they had endured. The plague may have ended, but its psychological toll lingered like a spectre, a dark and haunting presence that refused to be exorcised. In time, the survivors would rebuild their lives, but the memory of the plague would never truly fade. It would remain a haunting reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly the world could descend into chaos, and how deeply the human psyche could be scarred by the relentless spectre of death. The aftermath of the plague brought with it profound changes to the social structure of medieval society, reshaping the balance of power and altering the dynamics between peasants and the ruling class. The devastating loss of life left vast swathes of land untended, entire villages empty, and labour in critically short supply. The catastrophic decline in population disrupted the established feudal order, creating an unprecedented power shift that, in some cases, empowered the surviving peasantry in ways that had been previously unimaginable. Before the plague, society was rigidly stratified under the feudal system, a structure that placed peasants at the very bottom, tied to the land and subject to the whims of their lords. Lords held vast estates, and peasants worked the fields, producing crops and paying taxes, in exchange for protection and the right to live on the land. The relationship was one of exploitation, masked as mutual obligation, with the lord benefiting from the peasants' labour, while the peasants remained perpetually indebted, trapped in a cycle of servitude. However, when the plague decimated the population, the balance of power began to shift. Fields that once bustled with labourers now lay fallow, crops rotted in the ground, and livestock wandered untended through desolate villages. With so many dead, the demand for labour skyrocketed, creating a labour shortage so severe that landowners found themselves unable to maintain their estates without the remaining peasants. The survivors, who had once been expendable and easily replaceable, now became a scarce and valuable commodity. Sensing this newfound leverage, peasants began to assert themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Where once they had been forced to accept whatever meagre wages their lords offered, they now had the power to negotiate higher pay, better working conditions, and even freedom from the bonds of serfdom. Some peasants, emboldened by their newfound bargaining power, left their villages in search of better opportunities, moving to towns and cities where wages were higher and the prospects for upward mobility greater. This exodus of labour created a ripple effect throughout the feudal system as lords scrambled to retain their workers, often resorting to desperate measures to keep them bound to the land. Some attempted to enforce old feudal laws, demanding that peasants remain on the estates where they were born, but with so many lords vying for a dwindling workforce, such tactics became increasingly ineffective. Others resorted to bribery, offering higher wages, reduced taxes, or even the promise of land in exchange for continued service. For the first time, peasants could choose where to work, whom to serve, and under what conditions, effectively undermining the rigid hierarchies that had once kept them in place. The bargaining power of the peasantry grew to such an extent that in some regions they were able to demand outright emancipation, securing their freedom from the obligations of serfdom and transforming themselves into tenant farmers or wage labourers. The ruling class, however, did not take these changes lightly. For landowners, the shift in power dynamics was both alarming and destabilizing. Accustomed to controlling a submissive labour force, they now found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had once dominated. The resentment simmered, and in some cases, it boiled over into violent conflict. In England, for instance, the ruling elite attempted to reassert control by passing the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a draconian law that sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from leaving their estates. The statute also made it illegal for employers to offer higher wages, effectively criminalising the very bargaining power that the labour shortage had created. The intent was clear: to force peasants back into subservience and restore the pre-plague order. But the statute only fueled the peasants' growing sense of injustice and sparked widespread rebellion. In 1381, the discontent erupted into the Peasants' Revolt, a massive uprising that saw thousands of peasants marching on London, demanding the abolition of serfdom, fair wages, and an end to oppressive taxes. The revolt was brutally suppressed, and its leaders were executed, but the message was unmistakable. The old order was crumbling, and the peasantry was no longer content to remain silent and subservient. In other regions, the shift in power dynamics was less overtly violent, but equally transformative. In Italy, where cities like Florence and Venice had been devastated by the plague, the sudden scarcity of labour led to the rise of the artisan class. Craftsmen and tradesmen, once considered mere cogs in the feudal machine, now found themselves in high demand, able to command higher wages and set their own terms of employment. Some even formed guilds, organisations that protected their interests, regulated wages, and established standards of quality for their work. These guilds became powerful economic and political entities, challenging the authority of the feudal lords and asserting the rights of the working class in ways that would lay the groundwork for the economic and social changes of the Renaissance. In this way, the plague indirectly sowed the seeds for the emergence of a new middle class, one defined not by birthright but by skill, enterprise, and economic power. Even in rural areas, the social fabric began to shift. Land that had once been concentrated in the hands of a few powerful lords was now more readily available, as the death toll had left many estates without heirs. Some peasants were able to acquire small plots of land, becoming smallholders or independent farmers. The concept of land ownership, once reserved for the nobility, began to trickle down to the lower classes, altering the economic landscape and giving rise to a more diverse and fragmented structure of landholding. However, not all peasants were able to capitalize on these opportunities. The poorest of the poor, those without the skills or connections to negotiate better terms, often found themselves even worse off than before the plague. As landowners sought to recoup their losses, Some resorted to increasing rents or imposing harsher working conditions on those who remained bound to the land. The gap between the newly empowered and the perpetually impoverished widened, creating a stark economic divide that would persist for centuries. The plague also forced a re-evaluation of the concept of labour itself. For centuries, physical labour had been viewed as a lowly and degrading necessity, something to be endured rather than valued. But as the scarcity of workers drove up wages and made skilled labour a prized commodity, the cultural perception of work began to shift. Artisans, craftsmen, and agricultural workers began to take pride in their skills, seeing themselves not as mere servants, but as vital contributors to the economic and social fabric of society. This shift in perspective laid the foundation for a broader cultural transformation, one that would eventually manifest in the Renaissance, a period characterized by a celebration of human achievement, creativity, and individual worth. The plague, in its own dark and destructive way, had shattered the old order and made way for a new era of possibility, a world in which even the lowliest peasant could dream of a better life and, in some cases, achieve it. The effects of these social changes would be felt for generations, reverberating throughout medieval society and altering the trajectory of history itself. While the plague had brought untold suffering and devastation, it had also sparked a wave of social mobility, challenging the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system and planting the seeds of a more dynamic and fluid social order. The peasantry, once bound by the chains of serfdom, had tasted a measure of freedom, and they would not easily forget it. The question that remained was whether the ruling class would accept these changes or fight to restore the old order, a question that would play out in bloody conflicts, legal battles, and social upheavals in the years to come. The balance of power had shifted, and the world would never be the same again. The aftermath of the plague did not only reshape the social structure, it also had a profound impact on religion and spirituality, altering the very foundation of medieval belief systems. The plague, which struck indiscriminately, killing the pious and the wicked alike, forced people to question the nature of divine justice and the role of the church in protecting the faithful. As entire villages were wiped out and priests succumbed to the same fate as common peasants, the authority of the church began to crumble, and new spiritual movements emerged in response to the existential crisis. Before the plague, the church had been the central pillar of medieval life. It governed not only spiritual matters, but also dictated social norms, economic practices, and political allegiances. The church was the gatekeeper of salvation, and its clergy was seen as intermediaries between God and humanity. It was a time when people believed that prayers, sacraments, and acts of penance could avert disaster, prevent illness, and secure eternal life. But the plague shattered this illusion of spiritual security. As the plague swept across Europe, priests and monks, who were supposed to be the spiritual guardians of the community, fled in droves, abandoning their flocks in fear of contagion. Those who remained were often overwhelmed, unable to minister to the sheer number of dying and dead. The sick and the dying cried out for last rites, but with so many priests dead or dying themselves, many perished without receiving the sacraments. This failure to provide spiritual comfort during the most terrifying moments of life led to widespread disillusionment. For many peasants, the sight of empty churches and deserted monasteries was a jarring reminder of their spiritual abandonment. The very people who had preached that the church was the path to salvation had proven themselves powerless against the onslaught of the plague. If the priests could not save themselves, then what hope did the common peasant have? The notion of a loving, protective God seemed to dissolve under the weight of suffering and death, and the faithful were left grappling with the terrifying possibility that perhaps God had abandoned them, or worse, that God was punishing them for reasons they could not comprehend. In an attempt to make sense of the catastrophe, some turned to extreme forms of penance and self-mortification. The flagellant movement emerged as a direct response to the plague, spreading rapidly across Europe. Groups of men, women, and even children marched from town to town, whipping themselves in a gruesome display of self-punishment. They believed that the plague was a sign of God's wrath, and that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they could atone for the sins of the world and avert further divine punishment. The flagellants sang hymns of repentance and delivered fiery sermons, condemning the moral decay of society and accusing the church of corruption and neglect. They claimed to receive visions and messages from God, warning of further calamities unless humanity repented. To many peasants, the flagellants' fervour was a welcome contrast to the silence and inaction of the clergy. Some joined the movement, abandoning their homes and livelihoods to wander the countryside in search of redemption. But the church condemned the flagellants as heretics, branding their practices as dangerous and unorthodox. The Pope issued edicts to suppress the movement, and local authorities cracked down on their processions, arresting and executing some of the more radical members. Yet, despite the church's condemnation, the flagellants had already planted seeds of dissent, and their message resonated with the disillusioned and desperate. The spectacle of commoners openly defying church authority and claiming direct communication with God signaled a significant shift in the spiritual landscape. Meanwhile, others sought solace in more personal and mystical forms of spirituality. In the wake of the plague, the cult of saints and relics experienced a resurgence. People flocked to shrines, praying for intercession and protection from further outbreaks. Relics believed to possess healing powers became highly sought after, and desperate villagers would trade their meagre possessions for a splinter of a saint's bone or a drop of holy water. This growing obsession with relics, however, gave rise to a booming trade in counterfeit religious artifacts. Unscrupulous merchants preyed upon the desperation of the faithful, selling ordinary bones as saintly remains and claiming miraculous properties for worthless trinkets. The proliferation of fraudulent relics only deepened the sense of spiritual disillusionment as people began to question the legitimacy of the church's promises. As trust in the institutional church eroded, alternative spiritual movements gained traction. In regions like Bohemia and southern France, heretical sects such as the Lollards and the Hussites began to question the church's authority and the moral integrity of its leaders. They criticized the clergy's wealth and corruption, denounced the practice of selling indulgences, and advocated for a return to a simpler, more personal form of faith. These heretical movements were met with fierce opposition from the church, which launched inquisitions to root out dissenters and silence critics. But the damage had already been done. The plague had exposed the fragility of the church's authority, and its inability to protect the faithful from suffering and death had created a spiritual vacuum that the heretics were all too willing to fill. In some areas, the plague gave rise to apocalyptic fervour. Peasants gathered to hear self-proclaimed prophets who preached that the end of the world was at hand. They pointed to the plague as a sign of the last judgment, a divine warning that humanity had strayed too far from God's commandments. Some prophets claimed to receive visions of heavenly punishment, while others predicted that Christ's second coming was imminent. These apocalyptic movements sowed further discord as people abandoned their homes, gave away their possessions, and prepared for the end of days. Despite the rise of heretical sects and apocalyptic movements, some peasants clung even more fervently to traditional religious practices. They sought to reaffirm their faith by commissioning masses for the dead, making pilgrimages to holy sites, and donating money to the church in hopes of securing divine protection. But even these acts of devotion took on a desperate, almost frantic quality, as if the very fabric of their faith was fraying beneath the weight of unrelenting suffering. Over time, the plague left behind a complex spiritual landscape marked by contradictions. Some peasants became devoutly religious, clinging to the church as a source of hope and stability in a world turned upside down. Others became disillusioned and cynical, abandoning the church altogether and seeking solace in folk beliefs, mystical practices, or secular pursuits. Still others fell into spiritual despair, convinced that God had abandoned them and that life was nothing more than a cruel, meaningless cycle of suffering and death. The psychological scars of the plague endured long after the disease itself had subsided. The memory of mass graves, abandoned churches, and priests fleeing in terror lingered in the collective consciousness, a haunting reminder of how vulnerable humanity truly was. The very institutions that had once provided spiritual security had been exposed as fragile and fallible, and in the wake of that revelation, medieval peasants were left to grapple with profound existential questions. Was there a God? If so, why had he allowed such suffering? And if not, what meaning remained in a world so rife with death and despair? These questions would echo throughout the centuries, shaping the evolution of medieval spirituality and laying the groundwork for the sweeping religious reforms that would come in the centuries that followed. The plague, in its relentless march through village and town, had not only reshaped the physical and social landscape, it had also cracked open the very foundations of medieval faith, leaving the peasantry to search for meaning amid the ruins. The psychological toll of surviving the plague was profound, particularly for those who had witnessed the devastation firsthand. The constant presence of death, the haunting image of mass graves, and the pervasive fear of infection left indelible scars on the minds of medieval peasants. For many, the world became a darker, more unpredictable place, and the psychological aftershocks of the plague would linger for years, shaping behaviors, beliefs, and community dynamics in ways that would reverberate through generations. In the immediate aftermath, survivors grappled with a pervasive sense of survivor's guilt. Those who had lost entire families, neighbours, and friends were left to question why they had been spared. The randomness of the plague's devastation, killing some while leaving others untouched, fueled feelings of unworthiness and existential dread. People found themselves haunted by the memories of loved ones who had died horrifically, often without the comfort of last rites or a proper burial. In a society deeply steeped in religious beliefs, the inability to provide a Christian burial for family members intensified the psychological anguish. Many feared that the souls of the unburied might linger, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. The pervasive fear of the plague's return also weighed heavily on survivors. Even as the immediate danger passed, the spectre of another outbreak loomed ominously over daily life. Every cough, fever, or unusual rash became a potential harbinger of doom, a sign that the pestilence might be returning. This constant state of hypervigilance created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and paranoia, further eroding the fragile sense of security that survivors desperately sought to rebuild. In addition to fear and guilt, the sheer scale of death disrupted the traditional mourning practices that had once provided a sense of closure and communal solidarity. The sheer volume of corpses overwhelmed burial practices, leading to hasty and impersonal mass graves where bodies were piled one atop another, often without the customary prayers or rituals. This abrupt, unceremonious handling of the dead deprived the living of the opportunity to properly grieve and honour their loved ones, leaving emotional wounds that would fester over time. The psychological impact was particularly pronounced among children, many of whom had lost parents, siblings, or entire families. Orphaned children wandered the streets, their hollow eyes reflecting the trauma of watching their loved ones die. In some cases, children were taken in by extended family members or monasteries, but in many cases, they were left to fend for themselves, forming ragtag bands of orphans who roamed the countryside, stealing food or begging for scraps. These children, having witnessed death and suffering at an impressionable age, often grew up with a bleak and cynical worldview, their innocence irrevocably shattered by the horrors they had endured. For those who survived the plague but remained physically or emotionally scarred, life became a daily struggle to make sense of the incomprehensible. Some people exhibited symptoms of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, and a constant sense of impending doom. The trauma of watching loved ones die in agony, of hearing the cries of the dying, and of smelling the stench of decaying bodies left an imprint that no amount of prayer or penance could erase. The psychological toll was also evident in the breakdown of social cohesion. The plague had eroded the bonds of trust between neighbors, families, and even friends. In the chaos of the outbreak, people had turned on one another, accusing each other of spreading the disease or hoarding resources. In some communities, people refused to help the sick or bury the dead for fear of contracting the plague themselves. This erosion of mutual trust created an atmosphere of suspicion and isolation that persisted long after the plague had subsided. For some, the psychological toll manifested as a profound sense of nihilism. The relentless suffering and death led many to question the meaning of life itself. If God allowed such suffering to occur, then what was the point of prayer, piety, or good deeds? The plague seemed to render all human efforts futile, as if life itself was a cruel and senseless game in which death was the only certainty. This nihilistic outlook found expression in art and literature, as painters depicted macabre scenes of death and decay, and poets penned verses filled with existential despair. One such artistic expression was the emergence of the danse macabre, or the dance of death, a powerful allegory that depicted skeletons leading people of all social classes in a grim procession to the grave. The message was clear. Death spared no one, regardless of wealth, power, or virtue. The dance of death became a haunting reminder that life was fleeting, and that the plague had revealed the fundamental fragility of human existence. Despite the pervasive sense of despair, some survivors sought to cope with their trauma through hedonism and excess. Having faced death and survived, they adopted a carpe diem mentality, indulging in feasting, drinking, and other earthly pleasures as a way to numb the psychological pain. This behavior, however, was met with condemnation by the Church, which warned that such indulgence was sinful and would only invite further divine punishment. Others turned to more spiritual forms of coping. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased as people sought to atone for perceived sins and seek divine protection from future outbreaks. The Church promoted acts of penance, urging the faithful to confess their sins, donate to the poor, and pray for the souls of the dead. Some people even joined religious orders, dedicating their lives to prayer and service in hopes of securing divine favor. In certain cases, survivors sought solace in community rituals, attempting to rebuild the social fabric that the plague had torn apart. Village festivals, which had been abandoned during the height of the plague, gradually resumed, albeit with a somber undertone. Feasts, dances, and seasonal celebrations became a means of reaffirming life and reconnecting with neighbors. Yet, even in these communal gatherings, the memory of the plague lingered, casting a shadow over every laugh, every song, and every dance. The psychological scars of the plague also reshaped the way people viewed time and mortality. For many, the experience of living through such widespread death led to a heightened awareness of the fleeting nature of life. Time itself seemed to take on a new urgency as people rushed to marry, have children, or complete unfinished business before another catastrophe struck. The fear that death could arrive at any moment drove some to take risks they would never have considered before, seeking to extract as much as possible from life before it was too late. Perhaps one of the most profound psychological legacies of the plague was the emergence of a more fatalistic worldview. survivors had witnessed the randomness of death firsthand, and many concluded that life was beyond human control, governed by forces that were inscrutable and indifferent. This fatalism manifested in proverbs, songs, and stories, as people struggled to make sense of a world in which good deeds, prayers, and piety seemed to offer no protection from suffering. In the years that followed, the psychological scars of the plague would continue to shape the minds and hearts of those who had survived. The trauma of witnessing mass death, of losing loved ones without the chance to say goodbye, and of living in constant fear of the plague's return left emotional wounds that would persist for generations. For some, the world became a darker, more terrifying place. A place where death lurked around every corner and life was fragile, fleeting, and ultimately meaningless. Yet, paradoxically, for others, the experience of surviving the plague instilled a sense of resilience and fortitude. Those who had endured the worst that life had to offer emerged with a deeper appreciation for life's fleeting moments of beauty and joy. The psychological scars, though painful, also became a source of strength, a reminder that they had faced the abyss and lived to tell the tale. In this way, the psychological aftermath of the plague was not merely a story of trauma and despair, but also a testament to the enduring human capacity to survive, adapt, and find meaning amid the ruins. The aftermath of the plague did not merely alter the physical and social landscape of medieval Europe. It also profoundly transformed the cultural and artistic expressions of the time. The pervasive presence of death, suffering, and uncertainty left an indelible mark on medieval art, literature, and music, giving rise to hauntingly evocative works that encapsulated the collective trauma and existential dread of the era. Art, in particular, became a powerful medium through which survivors could process their grief and confront the spectre of mortality. Before the plague, medieval art was largely dominated by religious themes, depicting scenes of saints, angels, and biblical narratives that conveyed a sense of divine order and eternal salvation. But in the wake of the plague, this focus shifted dramatically. Artists began to incorporate more somber, macabre imagery, reflecting the pervasive fear of death and the fragility of human life. One of the most iconic artistic motifs to emerge during this period was the danse macabre, or dance of death. This allegorical representation depicted skeletal figures leading people of all social classes in a grim procession to the grave. Kings, queens, clergy, peasants, and children were all portrayed dancing hand in hand with death, emphasizing the indiscriminate nature of mortality. The message was clear: death spared no one, regardless of wealth, status, or piety. These chilling scenes served as a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of life, urging viewers to reflect on their own mortality and the inevitable approach of death. The dance of death became a widespread artistic motif, appearing in murals, manuscripts, and woodcuts across Europe. In some depictions, the skeletal figures wore tattered shrouds, their hollow eyes staring directly at the viewer, as if to underscore the haunting proximity of death. In addition to the dance of death, artists also began to depict scenes of mass burials, plague victims writhing in agony, and decaying corpses. These unsettling images were not merely intended to shock or frighten. They were a visceral expression of the collective trauma experienced by survivors. For those who had witnessed the horrors of the plague firsthand, these depictions served as a form of catharsis, a way to externalize the emotional turmoil and make sense of a world that had been irrevocably altered. Literature, too, was profoundly shaped by the plague. Writers who survived the outbreak often grappled with themes of suffering, death, and divine retribution, producing works that conveyed the existential angst of the period. One of the most notable examples is Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, a collection of stories written in the wake of the Black Death. Boccaccio sets the scene with a harrowing account of the plague's devastation in Florence, describing the streets filled with corpses, the breakdown of social norms, and the pervasive atmosphere of fear and despair. Yet despite the grim backdrop, the Decameron is not merely a chronicle of suffering. It is also a celebration of life, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. The 10 protagonists, who flee the city to escape the plague, take refuge in a secluded villa where they pass the time by telling stories. The tales they share range from bawdy and comedic to tragic and poignant, reflecting the full spectrum of human experience. In this way, Boccaccio's work encapsulates the paradox of the post-plague world, a world where death was ever present, yet life persisted, and moments of beauty and joy could still be found amid the devastation. Another significant literary work that emerged in the aftermath of the plague was William Langland's Piers Plowman. Written in the late 14th century, the allegorical poem presents a vivid depiction of a society grappling with moral decay, corruption, and economic upheaval in the wake of the plague. Langland's protagonist, Piers, is a humble ploughman who embarks on a spiritual journey in search of truth and salvation. Along the way, he encounters figures representing greed, falsehood, and corruption, reflecting the widespread disillusionment with the church and the social order that had been exacerbated by the plague. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales also bears the influence of the plague, though in a more subtle and nuanced manner. Chaucer's characters, a motley group of pilgrims travelling to the shrine of Thomas Becket, each tells stories that reveal the complexities of human nature. The tales are laced with dark humour and irony, suggesting that Chaucer, like Boccaccio, was acutely aware of life's fragility and the thin line between comedy and tragedy. Music, too, was profoundly affected by the emotional and psychological aftermath of the plague. Before the outbreak, sacred music dominated the cultural landscape, with hymns and chants reinforcing the authority of the church. But as the plague ravaged monasteries and decimated choirs, the tone of religious music grew darker and more sombre. Composers began to write hauntingly mournful pieces, lamenting the loss of life and invoking divine mercy. One of the most notable compositions from this period is the Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, a medieval Latin hymn that vividly depicts the Last Judgment, when the dead will rise to be judged by God. The hymn's ominous, repetitive melody and chilling lyrics convey a profound sense of dread and foreboding, capturing the apocalyptic atmosphere that pervaded Europe in the wake of the plague. The Dies Irae would go on to become one of the most influential pieces of music in Western liturgy, its haunting refrain echoing through cathedrals and chapels for centuries to come. Beyond formal art and literature, the plague also gave rise to a rich body of folk tales, songs, and oral traditions that conveyed the collective grief and trauma of the peasantry. These stories often featured allegorical figures such as Death, the Grim Reaper, or the Plague Maiden, a spectral woman who wandered the countryside, spreading death with her touch. In some tales, Death was portrayed as a skeletal figure carrying a scythe, harvesting souls like a grim farmer reaping a field of wheat. Other folk songs took on a more humorous or ironic tone, reflecting the dark, sardonic humour that often emerged as a coping mechanism during times of crisis. In these songs, Death was depicted as a mischievous trickster, playing pranks on the living and reminding them of the futility of earthly concerns. The use of humour in these tales served as a means of reclaiming some measure of power over the seemingly omnipotent force of death, allowing people to laugh in the face of their own mortality. In visual art, the motif of the memento mori also gained prominence, a symbolic reminder that life is fleeting and death is inevitable. Artists began incorporating skulls, hourglasses, and decaying corpses into their work, urging viewers to contemplate the transient nature of earthly existence. These grim symbols appeared not only in religious paintings, but also in secular art, reflecting the pervasive sense of existential uncertainty that had taken hold of the medieval psyche. As the decades passed, the artistic and cultural expressions that emerged in response to the plague would continue to evolve, eventually giving rise to new artistic movements that grappled with the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. The plague had stripped away the veneer of security and stability that had once defined medieval life, exposing the raw, unvarnished reality of human suffering. In its wake, artists, writers, and musicians sought to capture this new reality, creating works that were darker, more introspective, and deeply infused with a sense of existential dread. Yet, amid the darkness, there remained glimmers of resilience and hope. The very act of creating art, of telling stories, of composing music became a form of resistance against the overwhelming tide of death and despair. It was a way of asserting that life, no matter how fragile or fleeting, still held meaning and value. And in the centuries that followed, these artistic expressions would endure as haunting reminders of a time when death stalked the land and life hung by the thinnest of threads.